By the late 1980s, something important had shifted in British television. Myth no longer governed the world of the story. It no longer set the rules, demanded obedience, or shaped meaning from the outside. Instead, narrative momentum took over. Smuggler and its direct sequel, Adventurer, sit squarely within that change. These are not mythic series in the way writer Richard Carpenter's earlier work had been. They are historical adventures, energetic, mobile, plot-driven, and they make no attempt to disguise that fact. Where myth once structured the world, here it has withdrawn, leaving behind a setting rather than a system. And that difference matters. In earlier mythic television, characters moved within frameworks they did not control. The land, the past, or inherited obligations shaped events. Stories unfolded according to rules that were older than the people involved. In Smuggler and Adventurer, the world no longer demands belief. It supplies situations. The protagonists are defined not by destiny or inheritance, but by movement. They travel, they react, they adapt. Their identities are flexible, responsive, and above all, personal. This is adventure television in its purest sense. History functions as backdrop rather than authority. Period detail gives texture, not meaning. The past no longer speaks, it hosts. That shift is not a failure of imagination. It is an adjustment to a different television ecology. By the late 1980s, audiences were increasingly accustomed to faster pacing, clearer motivation, and narrative escalation. Stories were expected to move forward, not circle. Repetition began to feel like inertia rather than tradition. In that environment, myth could no longer operate as a governing force. It survived only as residue. Elements that once carried symbolic weight remained visible. Outlaws, marginal lives, contested authority. But they no longer structure the story. They colour it. The world does not insist on ritual. It does not enforce fate. It does not demand sacrifice. Instead, it presents obstacles. This is the key difference. In mythic television, events happened because they had to. In adventure television, events happen because they are next. Smuggler and Adventurer embrace that logic fully. The emphasis is on intrigue, danger, and consequence. Episodes build momentum through incident rather than obligation. Stakes are immediate and situational, not symbolic. There is no external system holding the characters to account, only the story itself. That makes these series highly effective examples of late period historical adventure. They are confident, accessible, and deliberately unburdened by metaphysical weight. But placed in chronological context, they also mark the end of a particular way of writing for television. In earlier work, myth acted as a brake as much as an engine. It slowed the story, deepened it, and occasionally obstructed progress. Characters could not simply act, they had to contend with forces that refused to hurry. Here, nothing resists momentum. The story wants to move, and the world allows it. That is the defining change. The sequel series Adventurer does not reverse this shift, it confirms it. The continuity of characters and setting is maintained, but the organising logic remains the same. What matters is what happens next, not what must be honoured. This is not myth thinning into parody. It is myth stepping aside, and that distinction is important. There is no sense here of embarrassment about the past, no irony, no attempt to undermine earlier modes of storytelling. The series does not mock folklore or history. They simply no longer require them. Television by this point had become more confident in its own forward motion. It no longer needed older systems of meaning to stabilize the story. Pace, clarity, and accessibility had become sufficient. For a writer adapting to those conditions, the response was not to resist, but to adjust. Smuggler and Adventurer demonstrate that adjustment clearly. They show what remains when myth is no longer asked to govern the world, character, incident, and movement. The pleasures of story are still present, but they are immediate rather than inherited. This makes them an important endpoint, not because they are weaker than what came before, but because they are different in kind. They represent a final stage in a long arc, from myth as presence to myth as structure to myth as background. Earlier programs trusted audiences to live with ambiguity, obligation, and systems that resisted explanation. By the end of the 1980s, that trust had shifted. Television now prioritized momentum over meditation. Stories no longer waited. Seen this way, Smuggler and Adventurer are not outliers, they are evidence. They show how a particular tradition of mythic television writing adapted when the conditions that sustained it were no longer dominant. They reveal what television kept and what it quietly let go. What was retained was storytelling itself, movement, intrigue, character. What was lost was the confidence that myth could still act as an organizing force. That loss didn't happen overnight, and it did not happen because of any single series. It emerged gradually as television changed its assumptions about how meaning should be delivered. By the time Smuggler and Adventurer arrived, the shift was complete. Myth had done its work, and television moved on. Taken together, these series closed the loop on a remarkable period of writing, one in which television believed it could still draw on older ways of structuring the world. What followed would be faster, clearer, and more tightly engineered. But it would not be mythic in the same way again. And thanks very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that. I will put a link to a Richard Carpenter playlist of all the videos I've made in the comments, and I will be back with another television show another time. Bye.